Okay, so one thing I wanted to talk about very briefly is the film, which we're going to go into more detail on the film when we cover obedience to authority, which will be in a couple weeks. So I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but did you all like the film? Did you enjoy it? I thought it was kind of cool. Better than watching the Milgram film again. All right, cool. Again, I was a very dorky person. You know, of course, I'm not like that anymore. But when I was in grad school, we used to have like parties where we would project the original Milgram film like across the dance floor. And yeah, that's how bad. It's pretty bad. I know. Like 3 of you are going to do that, though. That's the great thing. It's like 447 of you are like, I'm never coming back to this class, and 3 of you will be dancing to the Milgram film this weekend. One thing that's interesting about the film, right, is that they pretty much straight replicate the Milgram findings, right? The rates of obedience are really similar. The difference in rates of obedience, you shouldn't put a lot of stock in them because it could just be randomness. I mean, they pretty much find the same finding that Milgram found in the early 60s, right? But one thing that I just wanted to note, did you notice anything about that one guy, the one that was really good and wouldn't do it, you know? Did you notice anything specific about him? Any thoughts you might have on him? He was maybe a hippie. Was he a hippie? Maybe. I don't know that he was. Yeah. Yeah, you said he was a nonconformist. Did you? Yes. Yeah. I like that. He kind of, he stuck up for himself. He was very independent, and he was kind of pissed off, too, about the situation. Yeah. Was he a computer scientist? Ah, interesting. Well, yeah, well, that makes sense, because computer scientists are good people by nature. Yeah. There's this mythology about the original Milgram experiment that the people that didn't go all the way, there were 2 professions of people that wouldn't go all the way. Doctors, because they take the Hippocratic Oath or whatever, and electricians or electrical workers, because they know like what this means, like 450 volts. Like they couldn't self-deceive themselves into thinking, oh, this won't kill the person, you know. But that's bogus. I've read a lot of stuff about the Milgram film. I think that's just an urban legend. Okay. Really? I don't think that's the case. Okay, well, Sunny and I are having a disagreement. We'll continue this after class. Okay, so one other thing about the guy, I'm not, you know, you might be right. I want to talk to you about that. So one thing about the guy that I noticed, what did you see his T-shirt? Did you see what was on his T-shirt? Otters. Yeah, it was like a Monterey Bay aquarium with these cute otters on his T-shirt. And I don't know about you, but I would totally trust a guy with like otters all over his T-shirt. And I think that validates that because otters are awesome. So, okay. That's something that I noticed, and I had trouble focusing on his behavior because I kept watching the otters. You know, I'd be like, man, that guy's got the coolest otter T-shirt. Okay. All right. That was the main thing I wanted you to learn from that film. Also, the McDonald's thing. How freaky was that, huh? Like, whoa. Yeah, you can go online and read more about that. I guess that person or multiple people did that scam many, many times around the country. No, they think it was one guy. And I think it was like a former policeman, and he finally got busted. Does anybody know this? Let's say he's like a former policeman. Anyway, he was? Yeah. So anyway, yeah, you can go online and learn more about that, but that's totally freaky and terrifying. Okay, so this week we're going to start, so kind of take that obedience stuff it in the back of your head, and we'll bring it back in a couple weeks. I had to be out of town for that conference, so I figured that'd be a good time to watch a film, and also break up these lectures, which are becoming, you know, probably pretty monotonous for you. So we have wrapped the cognitive biases part of the class for the time being. When we come back later in the semester to automaticity and reading the Wilson book, as well as the Haidt book later on, we'll be talking more about the same kind of material we were doing in the cognitive biases lectures. But for the time being, we're going to go up in levels of analysis. And there's this kind of wave in the class where we start at a very individual level with cognition and cognitive biases. Then we go up to like conformity and obedience and status and stuff like that. And then eventually we're going to come back down in levels of analysis towards the end of the class and talk about some more psychological type phenomena like automaticity, which is basically unconscious influences on your behavior, happiness, and some other topics like that. So for now, we're headed up, so it's time to get very, very excited. Strap on your intellectual seatbelts. It's going to be big. But to touch on the cognitive biases thing, I want to again emphasize the role of the essay assignment, which fills out a sort of third level of learning that I'm expecting you to try to engage in the class, where we're not just going to learn ideas, the evidence for and against those ideas, but also try to apply those ideas to our everyday life. And the idea of the essay assignment is to get you to take the perspective of the other in a situation that would probably be pretty challenging to take the perspective of the other, one where you had a conflict and you thought you were right. And even if you had a balanced perspective, I asked you to essentially adopt an imbalanced perspective and just go off on the person. Because whether you did that in that conflict or not, we do that sometimes, right? And we do find it hard to take the perspective of the other. And I hope that by the end of that assignment, even if you were still right, in some objective sense about your argument, maybe somebody really was being an asshole to you or something like that, that you at least, maybe profited from this exercise, I hope. At least when I was an undergraduate, I was so bad at taking the perspective of the other that it was a very useful assignment for me. So hopefully you guys didn't have as far to go as I did, but it was useful for me, and that's why I assigned it. So now we're leaving cognitive biases. We're heading up in levels of analysis, and I think the natural thing to go to first, if you're going to start talking more about how people interact with one another, is to talk about conformity. And conformity is one of the first research topics that psychological social psychologists really, really got into. Sociological social psychologists also got into conformity a little bit later. But a nice way to sort of trace the evolution of the study of interpersonal behavior and the way that people interact with one another is to start with conformity. So that's what we're doing. And today, we're going to focus on the Sharif and Ash experiments. And those are people, Muzaffar Sharif and Solomon Ash. Okay, so what is conformity? Conformity is the tendency of individuals to change their expressed views and attitudes to those of others. And it's a very simple definition. It's probably roughly what you thought conformity was when you came in. But hopefully, we're going to kind of complicate that, tweak that out, and give you a more nuanced sense of how conformity works, the conditions under which it works, the extent of conformity pressures, and some fundamental distinctions in types of conformity pressures. And hopefully, I'll impart that to you by the end of this lecture. Okay, so the first major conformity study was conducted by Floyd Allport in 1924. And Floyd Allport was one of a pair of brothers who grew up in, I think, Indiana. I cheated. I looked that up earlier. I didn't just think of that. Okay, so Floyd, and do you know his brother's name? Ray? Red? Floyd? No, he's Floyd. Lloyd. Oh, that's a good guess. That's good. Floyd and Lloyd. That's exactly right. Floyd and Lloyd Allport. No, they didn't do that in those days. Floyd and Gordon Allport. Much cooler name. So Floyd and Gordon Allport grew up together in Indiana and then became two of the most famous psychologists of the first half of the 20th century. And they became famous for different reasons. Floyd Allport became famous for largely this research. He was a social psychologist. Gordon Allport was also a social psychologist, but also a personality psychologist, and was one of the first really famous personality psychologists. So that's kind of interesting, right? Since one of the themes of this class is that the individual matters less than you think, and that the situation matters more, and even amongst these brothers, they disagreed on this point, with Floyd being more of a pure social psychologist and Gordon being a personality psychologist. And actually, another interesting thing about them, Gordon Allport was famous for he had gone to Vienna to visit with Freud in I don't remember, very early in the 20th century. Met with Freud, told Freud, he was trying to make conversation with Sigmund Freud, the most famous psychologist in history at the time and maybe even now. He's nervous, he's trying to make conversation with Freud. He tells some story about some kid he saw doing something on the train ride over. He's just trying to make conversation with this famous guy. And Freud just kind of sits there, scratching his beard, and then is like, "You, sir, have a dirt fetish." And Gordon didn't even know what that meant. And no one really knows what that means and why the story led him to think that. But Gordon Allport was pissed off, as you probably would be if somebody sat there and was like, "You have a dirt fetish." And as a result, like, American psychology distanced itself from Freudian psychology. It really had this big effect on the evolution of American psychology because Gordon Allport, well, maybe he would have rejected Freud's ideas anyway since you know, a lot of them are really lame, but this did kind of accelerate things because Freud was not very politically savvy in this interaction. So anyway, Floyd Allport in 1924 designed the first modern lab study of conformity. There's other studies that are kind of like conformity. This one is specifically, it's about conformity pressures and what they do. So in the study, he had participants rate the pleasantness or unpleasantness of a series of odors. This sounds like a study that you would want to be in, right? You know, you get a bunch of graduated cylinders with vile odors in them, and you rate just how unpleasant those odors are. And the finding, pretty simple finding, was that people tended to avoid making extreme judgments in the presence of others. So when people were run individually in the study, they'd be like, oh, that's an awful, awful smell. Oh, that's a wonderful smell, you know, Professor Allport. When they were in group settings, they tended to try to avoid this. And Allport called this a moderation effect. That people tended to moderate their judgments in the presence of others. And does this ring a bell, like, you know, like from everyday life? Like when you're asked to give your opinion in some group setting and you don't know what everybody else thinks yet, you kind of try to sit there in the middle and you're like, oh yeah, I kind of like that movie. I kind of disliked that movie. What did you think? You know? Because you don't want to, you know, you don't want to take a position and then look like an idiot and wind up disagreeing with people because, you know, you have no true beliefs. You're totally capricious. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. Anyway, so people did this phenomenon of like not giving their strongest opinion that they would have given in private because they're sort of thinking, oh, I don't want to set myself up to be massively disagreeing with these people. Okay. Ironically, Floyd Allport gave a sort of Freudian-type explanation saying that there was an instinctual submission to the group. That sounds sort of like Freudian language. But isn't that far from the truth, that people conform to group attitudes? Okay, so that's the Allport study. Gordon and Floyd Allport are brothers. We'll talk about them again later in the semester. Very interesting. You could call them the dynamic duo if you wish. Okay, so the next conformity study happens in 1936, and this one's really famous. And this was conducted by Muzafer Sharif, who was born in Turkey but immigrated to America and was a famous American social psychologist. And Sharif was interested in norm formation. Well, he was interested in a lot of stuff. He was interested in intergroup conflict, and we're going to talk about him again when we do intergroup conflict later in the semester. But for the time being, we'll talk about his interest in norm formation. And he had a huge influence on the evolution of thought about conformity and social norms. And what he was interested in was, how is it that groups come to uniformity in their opinions about things? So Allport had this demonstration about, you know, moderation of opinion in front of others. And what Sharif is interested in is, when do we obey norms? When is it the case that some social norm emerges in a group that everybody obeys and everybody ends up saying and doing the same thing? So this is what Sharif was interested in. And before I tell you about the study, I want to tell you one interesting thing about Sharif. I just heard this about a year ago. He used to go to work. He used to wear a cape. A cape. A cape to work. Like a vampire or something. I don't get it. I don't know. I don't have any idea why he did that, but he wore a cape. What's more, I heard he'd wear a cape and short sleeves. Right? That's kind of tacky, right? You can't... if you're going to wear the cape, you got to wear long sleeves. I feel like I've never seen somebody with a cape, but I don't think I could pull off with the short sleeves. Okay. I just thought I'd tell you that. So, what Sharif needed was some kind of stimulus to do his studies on social norms that was very ambiguous. Some kind of stimulus where he could use group pressure to sort of push individual opinion around, okay? And he wanted, so he wanted something really ambiguous, where you weren't really sure what the right answer was. So, Sharif was reading some scientific, papers and came along this thing called the autokinetic effect. Have you ever heard of the autokinetic effect? So the autokinetic effect is this tendency in the course of perception, in the course of vision, for us to not be very good at holding fixed points of light steady in our vision against an all-black background. And it's something that they noticed first with astronomical observation. So, astronomers who are documenting the movement of the stars through the heavens would be looking through these telescopes. It would be totally black at night, and they've got this one star, and they're trying to document where it is, and it seems to be moving, and it makes it very difficult to document exactly its location. But it was also an effect that was found, and this is when they started doing research on it, by pilots. And I think the Navy did research on it, the American Navy did research on it, because they'd be flying along, they'd be trying to follow some other plane, and it would be, you know, this dot of light in front of them, and it would seem to move. And a lot of people actually think that some of the early reports of UFOs was actually people just having the autokinetic effect, pilots having the autokinetic effect and being like, oh, clearly that's a UFO, this, you know, this piece of light that's moving around. So here's a diagram of the autokinetic effect. I don't really have anything to say about this except I thought it looked cool. Okay. So point of light is here. You have trouble holding it steady. Okay. So great. That's what the eye looks like. Okay. In his studies, he ran two conditions in these studies. And he would either assign people to be in an individual experiment or an individual setting or a group setting. And what he did was he'd take a bunch of people. Well, no, he'd take 1, 2, or 3 people, 1 if it's individual, 2 or 3 if it's a group setting, and put them in an entirely dark room and shine a bit of light against the wall. And if I could find that laser pointer thing, well, you can imagine what this looked like. And what he did was he told the participants in the study that it's moving, that the piece of light, or that the little dot of light is going to move around, and that they should identify how much it moves in inches. But knowing that the autokinetic effect makes the thing bounce around sort of erratically in your vision, or appear to, he actually just fixed it. You know, so there's actually just a fixed point of light, but it appears to move around because we have this autokinetic effect. So he didn't actually move the thing. And I've been in a study like this, or a replication of the Sharif study, and it was pretty cool. I'm just going to tell you that. Okay. So in the individual experiments, what he found was that participants would say, you know, a pretty big estimate at first. They'd say, oh, it moved like a foot. And then maybe they'd say, this, you know, on a next trial, he'd say, okay, I'm going to move it now. Tell me how far it moves. They'd say, oh, it didn't move that time. It was like 0 inches. And then the next trial, they'd say 2 inches. And what he found was that people tended to gravitate towards some kind of personal standard, some kind of estimate of how much it moves. Why do people do that? I guess because it's this really ambiguous situation, and they just don't know what the right answer is. So they sort of take their past estimates as evidence for like what the next best estimate is. So people at first will say it moves a lot. No, this time it didn't move much at all. Now it's somewhere in the middle. Now it's somewhere in the middle. And people just, they're trying to give a credible answer in this setting. So they gravitate towards more moderate answers, sort of like a private moderation effect. So that's what happens in private. You sort of develop a standard for what's plausible for how much this light is moving, and you keep kind of saying that standard. In the group experiments, he would bring in 2 or 3 people at once, put them in the dark room, put the red light on the wall, and have them give judgments again about how much the light moved, and have them go in random orders. There wouldn't be order effects. So that, you know, if Joe is a really influential person and, you know, Jerry is easily influenced, and we don't always have Joe influencing Jerry. So he would randomize the order each time. He'd be like, okay, this time, you know, Susan goes first and Sally goes second. So what he found was 2 kinds of influence. Remember that on each trial, everybody estimates. He's like, okay, I'm going to move the light, and everybody should estimate how much it moves. And everybody gives an estimate in a random order. And then he says, okay, we're going to do another trial. Now everybody estimate how far the light moves, again, in a randomized order. And he just does that several rounds. And what he observed was 2 sorts of influence. One, within trial influence. Within a trial, the first person might go, it moved 1.5 feet. And then the second person would say, oh, I think it moved 9 inches. And the next person would say, I think it moved 12 inches. And there'd be this tendency across the trial for like the 3 people to give you know, pretty similar answers. There was this kind of conformity within the trial. But then he also found an across-trial kind of conformity where there was some kind of general tendency, even though he was saying I'm going to move it a different amount this trial than last time, people would kind of stick to whatever was the sort of answer, the average answer from the previous round. Does this make sense? Okay, so no, that's not good. When nobody says anything, I get nervous. Okay, all right. Within trial and across trial, conformity is going on as people sort of gravitate towards the group average. Conformity, right? So some sessions, he would, okay, so in some additional sessions, or no, in the same group sessions, he would start people either individually in separate rooms, showing the red light against the wall, against this black background, or he would start them in a group and then break them up into individuals. So 2 different types of research now that I'm talking about. You start individually, and then you're put in a group setting, or you start in a group setting, and then you're split off into the individual settings. And what he observed was, I really wish I had that laser pointer now. So what he observed was, anyway, in the individual, so here's these are the actual data from the paper that he published in 1936. Here's the individual first, and then they're broken up into groups. Or sorry, then they're put together into groups. And then they're in groups, and then they're broken up into individual sessions. Does this make sense? Okay, and then this is like 4 different groups in each condition. Okay, and these are all 2-person groups, subject 1, subject 2. And this is their estimates in inches of how much this is moving. And these are raw data. These are not averaged or anything. This is 4 sessions of 2 people starting out as individuals and then going into the group. And they go into the group on the second trial, I think. And in the group setting, yes, they start individual and then they go group, group, group. In this one, they start group, 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 and then they go individual. Now, what he's interested in here, oh, sweet, thank you. Man, this thing is cool. Aha, all right. Ooh, it's green, all right. So, okay, so here, look here, and there, and there, and there. Here, these individuals give these initially very different estimates, right? One person's saying, oh, it's moving 3 inches. This person's saying it's moving 8 inches, This person's saying it didn't move at all. This person's saying it moved 3.5 inches. But then they're put in the group, and what happens, this is them giving the ratings individually, right? They don't even know what the other person's ratings are. But then, with the second, third, and fourth trials, they're in the group, and they tend to moderate, they tend to move towards the average, right? Right here, these people had very different impressions at first, and then they almost instantly go to almost no difference, and then really no difference. Here, a couple inches different when they're in different rooms. They're in the same room. They gravitate towards each other. This one's pretty stark as well. They actually are moving towards each other here, right? So normally, they would settle on a personal standard and just keep saying it the whole way. But not, I'm enjoying this laser pointer. I know I'm overdoing it with the laser pointer. But not when they're in the group. They gravitate towards each other and stay there. So this is good evidence for conformity, right? When you're on your own, you'll say what you think. When you're put in the group, you'll say the average of what the group thinks. Okay. What happens here, where you start in the group and then you're broken up into individual sessions? They assimilate to the group norm. They assimilate to one another, across these 3 trials. Not that different than here, They assimilate. And then when they're broken up into individual settings, what happens? Do they revert to like whatever they might privately think? Or do they stick with the group norm? What do you see? They stick with the group norm. And this gives us a clue to the kind of influence that's happening in the Sharif setting. Because there's at least a couple kinds of influence. We'll go into more depth on this later in the lecture. But one kind of influence involves doing what other people are saying because you think they're right. And you're trying to figure out what the right answer is. And that seems to be what's happening here, right? They take the group away, and you stick with what the group said, right? And so people seem to be genuinely convinced by the group on what the right answer is. But another kind of influence is the kind of influence where you go along with the group, even though you think you know better, but you're trying to curry favor with the group, or you're afraid of looking like an idiot, or you don't want to be embarrassed. And if that was the case here, you'd expect when they get to the end that they'll split off, right? And say, oh, I actually wanted to say 10 inches the whole time, or here I wanted to say 6 inches. This person wanted to say 0 inches. But no, they stick with the group because they're genuinely influenced. They really are adopting the group norm. So when you start with the individual judgment, you see this initial diversity and then congruence, or convergence, sorry. And when you start with the group, you see a quicker convergence because people never even entertained any kind of private opinion. And then it persists when the individuals are separated. A question? The question is this just a consistency effect, cognitive dissonance theory, and so on, or the Cialdini commitment and consistency chapter 2, 3? Is this just a consistency effect? Well, while yes, this exhibits the pattern of a consistency effect, if you look over here, it's not just about consistency, right? Because if you made your commitment alone in a room, cognitive dissonance theory would say you'll stick with it, right? And this conformity stuff doesn't matter. I mean, according to cognitive dissonance theory, it doesn't say anything about interaction with other people, social influence, conformity dynamics. It would say straight lines, here, straight lines here, no difference. But we're talking about conformity, and so we're finding you put in conformity pressure, you get convergence, and people stick with it. So I would say no, it's pretty good evidence for a specific type of conformity. Okay, other questions? Yes, sir. So I planted this man in the audience to ask the exact question that begs, well, 2 slides from now. So yes. So the question was, this seems to be predicated on people not having a strong opinion, right? They pretty readily, I love this thing, they pretty readily adopt the group norm. I don't even need to use this, so whatever, okay. They pretty quickly adopt the group norm, and then they stick with it because they have no strong opinion, right? You can't tell how much the thing is moving. You don't know, right? Is that 2 inches, 1 inch? If it was dark, you'd be even more confused. So, so yes, these effects, the strength of these effects seems to be predicated on the fact that people had no strong initial opinion. So, yeah, excellent question. And then the question was also, are there any examples where people do have a strong initial opinion and you still see conformity effects? We'll get to that next. Okay, some conclusions from the Sharif conformity experiment. First, individuals tend to establish a personal range of answers when run individually. That's not that interesting for conformity research, but it's a little bit interesting, I guess, for just understanding how people make judgments. Next, in groups, they tended to use the other members to establish that range. Because people are trying to figure out, I want to give a credible range of answers here, because this experimenter, is expecting that, or I assume they are. And so you either rely on your own opinion or you rely on the group. Then, the influence persists after individuals leave the group, and the takeaway is that in uncertain situations, where you're not sure what your opinion is, group influence tends to be very high. I mean, really high, right? Like, people don't have any individual difference in opinion in the group influence. In the individual group, they do have an individual opinion, and they freely get rid of it. So ambiguity is high, conformity is very high as well. And in follow-up research, actually, there's a lot of follow-up research on the Sharif conformity setting. A lot of it's very interesting. My favorite, I'll just drop this one because I think it's kind of cool. It's a little bit of a digression. My favorite follow-up to the Sharif experiment, they ran sessions like the individual group conditions, like these, except they started to, after a few trials, substitute out people from the group. Like, they take one of the people out, put a new person in. And I think they ran like 4-person sessions or something like that. So there's like 4 people. And what they were interested in is whether you could swap out everybody one by one and find that the group norm persisted, because you're doing this gradual swapping. If you were to swap out everybody at once, they'd jump to like a whole different group norm, right? They'd go from like here to here, say, right? Because they're totally different people. They don't know what the group norm used to be. But if you take them out one by one and put in new people, you'll find that the norm persists as the new people assimilate to the old norm. Does this make sense? So this is cool, right? This is kind of how culture works, right? Because social norms and culture can have longer lives than the individuals they inhabit, right? So like social norms that you obey may have been around for 100 years, 40 years, 400 years. And those norms are stronger than we are in a sense. They're gonna be taught to new people who will inherit them and enact them, and they'll live on past us. And so we're sort of like carriers for society. We're sort of like carriers for social norms and culture. And this research shows that, that it sort of is feasting on us. We don't live as long as a lot of the norms that we obey, which is, I think, interesting. It's a nice demonstration of that. All right. I mean, one thing you could call that is like anachronistic norms. There are all these examples of norms that we obey, but we don't have any like good reason to obey them, or it's very strange why we obey them, and we don't know, where they came from. We say, oh, why is it that we, why is it, for example, that men's suits have that split down the back, And the reason is men used to ride on horseback all the time, and so they needed to not tear the back of their suit jacket, right? Or why is it that Indians have a taboo on eating cows, right? Even though some anthropologists, or this is an anthropological theory, this might not be true, but one theory says that that taboo came from the fact that it would have been really, really bad to kill cows because they were much more useful as pack animals for helping with agriculture, say 2,000 years ago. Now, maybe it'd be nice to have a hamburger. Yeah. Yes, sir. Or maybe it wouldn't be. I don't know. Your opinion. This man has heard another theory about the Indian cow thing. So we'll talk about that later. Okay. Like I say, it's an anthropological theory. Cultural materialists like Marvin Harris have a whole bunch of these, of theories of where contemporary norms in societies come from, like taboos on eating shellfish or eating cows and or eating pork. And they might be true, they might not be. But the point is, probably some of those sort of explanations are true. That some of our norms that we obey now, we obey because we sort of inherited them, and their old functionality is lost. Yes? Christy, I know that. I was going to say that. Of anachronistic norms? Yes. One theory of why men, there's a norm to carry your bride past the threshold on like wedding day and stuff, wedding night or whatever, is that it's like it goes back to like early Eastern Europe where women were not voluntarily getting married, and so you literally had to carry them over the threshold because they didn't want to be there. I know. I don't know. It's a theory. I don't know that that's true, but it's cute, right? You kind of want to tell that to your friends, right? I do not necessarily endorse that theory. Also, that the best man, this is a whole set of possibly urban legends, possibly totally valid theories of marriage rituals. Another one is that best men, the reason we have best men is you needed help to abduct your bride. And in a way, I don't know the weddings you've been going to, but best men are still a little like that. Okay. So those are some, I don't know if those are true. Those could be apocryphal. Apocryphal. Okay. Other questions? Okay, but anyway, that modification of the Sharif experiment where they do the generational thing is, I think, a nice profound demonstration of how it is that norms can survive and move across people. And it also is this interesting insight that the way that human lives work, where we have overlapping generations, so like, a handful of us will die off every year and be replaced by new people, and we have these overlapping lives like this, wherein we can teach the next generation these things, that is part of why society and culture is able to evolve and be passed on for so long. If we had full replacement somehow every 20 years, then everybody would forget everything and we wouldn't pass this stuff on. So it's an interesting insight. Okay. Let's talk about the Asch conformity experiment. So Solomon Asch is one of my favorite social psychologists, and he came along after Sharif, and he published this classic conformity study in 1951, and he was interested in whether people would conform to something that was contrary to fact, answering this man's question. What's up? And Sharif had purposefully used this incredibly ambiguous setting, right? Because he wanted to show the extremes of group influence, that you would assimilate entirely to the group attitude in the presence of others. But Asch was like, okay, that's one kind of influence. That's one kind of conformity. But is that the whole story? Do we always exhibit this pattern where we conform and then stick with the group attitude because we didn't know the right answer? So I'm doing this again, I'm sorry. We didn't know the right answer, and we thought the group was right, and we actually revise our real opinion underneath, Is that the story? Or is it ever the case that maybe we conform when we know the right answer, and we just fake it? We just go along because we don't look like idiots in front of people. And what he did was he created a line judgment task that involved one participant and 8 Confederates. Please be quiet back there. Yes, sir. Yes, you. Yes, yes. Okay, so created a line judgment task involving one participant and 8 Confederates. Very expensive study to run, right? You can't run studies like this very much because you have to pay 8 Confederates for every one participant that you run. And what he did in the setting was, I'm using it again, I love this thing. So he would show people a bunch of trials like this, where there's these 3 comparison lines, and you're supposed to say which one of these 3 comparison lines this line is most similar to in length, or identical to in length. So this is a very simple task, right? Do you guys know the right answer to this one? Why are you guys messing with me? I am in the Asch experiment now. That's very clever. Everybody's like saying, it's C, Rob. Well, of course it's C. I knew that. Okay, obviously the right answer is A. So in this setting, in this experiment, you're asked a bunch of questions like this. Incredibly easy. You know exactly what the right answer is, right? And what Asch wanted to create was a situation where the individual would face, possibly for the first time in his life, a situation in which a group unanimously contradicted the evidence of his senses. I love that. It's so nice. So what's he doing here? What is he doing? Well, what he's saying is that in everyday life, there's two kinds of conformity that are going on. There's the kind of conformity where you just don't know the right answer, and you go along with the group to try and get it right. And then if the group went away, you'd keep saying that. Another kind of conformity is the kind where you obey the group because you don't look like an idiot. You want to be, accepted in the group, and you're worried you'll be made fun of or sanctioned or silently judged. And these are different things, right? They're different things. If you were broken off into individuals after that, you would go back to saying probably what you really thought, and you would only go along with the group because you didn't want to look like a fool. Christy, you have a question. What's it?
These two types of conformity have
They do. I'm going to get to that. It's going to be this. It's good. These two types of conformity do have different names, and you're going to be so excited when I tell you, and it's in a few slides. Okay, so what he's doing here is he said, okay, so Sharif's already created this setting where you don't know the right answer, right? He created this very nice setting where you have no clue what the right answer is. You rely on the group to get it right. And that is an artificial setting we might not find in everyday life, this highly ambiguous thing. I'm going to use experiments to create a very artificial situation where you know the right answer. You're sure what it is, and these people are telling you the opposite is the answer. He wants to create a situation in which a group unanimously contradicts the evidence of your senses. And note that he's not trying to be realistic in creating the setting, right? He's trying to make an artificial experiment that isolates an effect. He doesn't want to create a situation you've been in all the time in your life. He wants to create this situation for the first time in your life that tests exactly his idea, that people will go along with the group even if they know the group is wrong. Okay, so what happens? Sorry about that, Nora. Okay, what happens? On several trials, the group unanimously picks the wrong line, right? So they'll say, like what you all were saying to me, they'd say C, for example, in this one. And the task, totally unambiguous, participants, when they were run individually and shown a bunch of trials like this, they always got the right answer, or essentially always got the right answer. They made errors less than 1% of the time. But on 18 of the trials, on 12 of the 18 trials, they did 18 of these questions, and on 12 of those trials, the 8 Confederates would all say the wrong answer. And that would be a good test of conformity, right? It's a situation where your private opinion is different from what the group is telling you is right. So what happened? On these 12 critical trials out of 18 total trials, participants, on average, made 3.4 errors across those 12 trials. Are they errors in the sense they got it wrong? They may feel like they had good reasons to do it. What Ash also found, in addition to finding this kind of surprisingly high level of conformity, where a third of the time, when you're given this trial where you know the right answer, but the group's saying the opposite, you fall in line with the group and say purposely the wrong thing. In addition, he found individual variance, right? He found a lot of individual variance. So individuals range from 0 errors to 11 errors out of 12. And about like half of people, I think, got 0 errors. Mike, do you remember? Like half of people? Yeah, so like half of people didn't conform at all. And about half of people conformed to some extent, and they conformed, to a wide range of degree of conformity, from 1 out of 12 to 11 out of 12 trials. So one thing I want to do whenever we have these big experiments is sort of reflect on the person versus the situation debate. Okay? So if life was all about personality and situations didn't matter, then you couldn't line up 8 people to tell you to do something that was contrary to what you privately thought. And or you could do that, but you wouldn't conform. You wouldn't fall in line with what with what they're saying, right? Because what you privately think, you're going to express that, right? So here you see the power of the situation, right? The situation is weighty. It leads you to go from 1% errors to 32% errors. That's a big difference. This big, powerful situation where these people are looking at you, given the wrong answer, you'll tend to conform. It moves up your conformity, your error rate, 31%, right? But we're also seeing that individuals still matter, right? Half these people don't care. Well, or they maybe care, but they're not falling in line with the group judgment. They're not conforming. The other half are conforming to one extent or another, and there's one guy who's conforming on 11 of 12 trials who has no integrity. Okay. I don't know. I feel bad. That guy's probably still alive. Okay. So he had lots of integrity. He was just in a tough situation. So here are some examples of what people said. They were interviewed afterwards because Ash was interested in, like, what's going on in your head, or what will you say is going on in your head. One nonconformist said, I can't help it. That's 1. He's giving the answer 1, 2, 3. Which comparison line is it? And he's saying, I can't help it. That's 1. He's apologizing for giving what he knows is the right answer, right? Another one is, he's like, look, you all are probably right, but you may be wrong, and then gives the right answer. So these people are apologizing, they're rationalizing their nonconformity. They're trying to explain to these other 8 people why it is that they're contradicting them. 8 people go, you got to go, and you're going to contradict all of them because you just don't see it that way, and you make apologies for your honesty, really. A conformist said, if I'd been first, I probably would have responded differently, right? So he admitted, I'm falling in line with the group norm. And then, this is what he said afterwards when interviewed. And then another one said, they answered with such confidence, I felt like I had to fall in line with the group norm. And a lot of people reported that they thought some kind of illusion was at work, where for some reason they couldn't see the right answer, but the other 8 people could. And we'll talk more about that. Oh yeah, so which of these people do you think is the subject? Guy in the middle, definitely, yeah. And that, you can imagine being that guy, right? Like these guys, they're acting all nonchalant. This guy looks like the Fonz from Happy Days. That guy looks like, I don't know, like my father's yearbook picture. And this guy is just like, what the hell is going on, you know? So Ash classified the reactions that people gave afterwards into 3 categories. 1, distortion of perception. There were some people that reported that they saw what the majority saw. Okay, so some people are saying, I saw, line 3 as being the right answer. Okay, so that's why I said line 3. Okay, don't give me a hard time. So in these, Ash concludes, these people actually distorted what they saw because the 8 people told them this answer. Another category of reaction, distortion of judgment. People decided that their perceptions were inaccurate. Okay, they knew that they saw this one line to be different from, or to be the right line, and then they heard everybody else say something different. So they decided, yes, I'm seeing what I'm seeing, but I'm going to give a different answer because there's something wrong in between. I don't really understand this class of reaction, but whatever. And then a third group reported distortion of action, that they knew the group was wrong, but they didn't want to seem different from the group. So there's 3 classes here. Some people are saying, I saw that answer the way I reported. I'm not lying, I'm nothing. These people must have just affected the way I perceived it. The other ones are saying, no, I perceived the opposite of what I said, but I decided to make a different judgment because everybody else seemed to say something else. And then another group is like, no, I knew exactly what was going on. I knew they were wrong, and I just fell in line. And actually, most people said distortion of perception after the study. And not that many people said distortion of action. Okay? So let me ask you this question. Do you believe them? I don't either. I don't know. It would be interesting to rerun the study. I mean, the thing is, you can never really ask people, right? I mean, there's no way to really run the study that I know of and get it right. I mean, you could have them, rather than be interviewed, you could have them write something down and then not attach their name to it, and maybe they would tell you the truth. But I don't think there's really a way to really know. I don't know. There's clever experimental designs. But it would be nice to know the real answer of like whether these people really saw what the group was telling them they ought to see, or if, which is my guess, pretty much everybody was in the 3rd category, where they knew the group was wrong, and they just lied to go along with the group. That's my guess, is almost everybody was in that category, and they were just ashamed to say it, right? Because especially in American culture, there's this major stigma against not behaving like an individual and not saying your sincere actual judgment. This is not as much the case in other cultures, but in our culture, even in the 50s, there's a stigma against just going along with the group for no good reason. Okay, so let's take like a 3-minute break, and then we'll get back to the lecture after that. Okay. All right, so where were we? We were here. We were talking about the 3 classes of reasons that people gave for why they conformed in the Ash conformity experiment. And here's some more details about the results of that experiment. One interesting detail, I think this is kind of interesting. They've done studies where they had different numbers of people that were Confederates in the study. So in this study I just presented to you, there's 8, right? But they did different studies where there's 1 or 2 or 3 or 7 or 10 or whatever. And what they found was that once you get to 3, you get the same level of conformity you'll get after that, at least in this setting. I mean, that doesn't mean that that's always true or some rule for life that 3 people pressure you as much as 100 would. I doubt that's the case. But what they found was, yeah, that the conformity levels leveled off at 3 or more, which is kind of interesting. And that makes sense. I think if it's it's 1 person, then you're like, well, shit, we just disagree about this. If it's 2 people, it's not so hard to stand up. And I do agree that something about 3, you kind of feel like you're up against a group. I don't know. I feel like I don't know. Also, they found one dissenter. If you put in one dissenter in the group, so like maybe 7 people say the wrong answer, but then the dissenter says, obviously, line 1 is the right answer, that was enough to essentially eliminate the effect entirely. So if you could just get a little bit of credibility to disagree with the group norm, then people don't agree with the group norm. So that obviously would not be the case in like the Sharif setting where it's highly ambiguous. But it's the case in the Ash setting where you know the right answer. You want to give the right answer at some level probably, but you don't because of conformity pressure. Yes, ma'am? Yeah, the question was, and you got that from the Ash reading? From the, yeah, okay. Yeah, the question was, didn't they find that people, if they had already been conforming on some trials, and halfway through the experiment, they essentially introduce a dissenter, or have one of the Confederates start dissenting on the critical trials, that the person kept conforming anyway due to possibly cognitive dissonance? Didn't they find that? I have no idea, but that's very interesting, and I'll go reread the paper, because that sounds cool. That would be totally interesting. It is actually kind of similar to an experiment that I ran, which we'll talk about next week. So good question, and I don't know the answer to that. Okay, Stanley Milgram, the obedience experiment guy, the guy who studied obedience to authority with the shocking stuff, the guy that we watched the replication of his research for on Thursday. Stanley Milgram, for his dissertation, which he did when he was like 27 or something like that, he replicated the Ash study in 2 different countries, in Norway and in France. And he was interested in how, well, they used to call culture in those days national character, which is kind of weird. We don't say that anymore because it sounds like maybe genetic or something to us. Now we say culture for all that stuff. And what he did was, yeah, he replicated the Ash experiment in Norway and in France. Some of you here are Norwegian and might find this interesting. What he found was that the Norwegians exhibited a similar level of conformity to the Americans, and then the French exhibited far lower levels of conformity than Americans. And that kind of fits with the sort of stereotype of French people as willing to disagree, very willing to disagree. My close French friends have exhibited that. But that's, maybe that's great, right? I mean, conformity in the Ash setting is not exactly honorable. Some other replications, some other studies that were conducted of the Ash setting, of the Ash study in other settings or under different conditions. Perrin and Spencer failed to replicate the Ash study findings. They couldn't get 8 Confederates to pressure a single subject in 1980 to fall in line with the group judgment. They concluded that the Ash effect was a child of its time, that it was something you could find in the 1950s when everybody was really conformist, but you couldn't find it now in the 1980s when people, weren't conformist anymore. So that was their conclusion. Having lived in the 80s, I'm not so sure I agree with their description of our respective times. But anyway, but that is this idea that 1950s U.S. was super conformist, so maybe the Ash study was an artifact of that. Further, American college scene, the American college scene in the 1950s was very homogenous. Notice that all the subjects in that study were white males. That's partly because that was mostly college students in those days were white males. So very homogenous. White males from middle, maybe upper class backgrounds, or maybe, upper middle, upper class backgrounds. Very homogenous, very tending towards conformity in these settings. Okay, Nicholson and Rocklin in 1985 replicated it in the US and the UK, did find the relatively high levels of conformity, but lower than the original. So this is kind of evidence that, yes, the dynamics of the Ash experiment are still true, but they're somewhat less. LaLancet and Standing in 1990 failed to replicate the Ash finding of conformity on these kinds of trials. Perrin and Spencer, I already told you that. Don't know why I wrote that twice. Nito, 1995, replicated it via a computer in Portugal and did pretty well. So in a computer-mediated setting where you're not even giving your opinion, in the presence of others, people still conformed at close to the same rate as people did in the original Ash setting. That was in Portugal, though, not here. And actually, I ran a study, which we'll talk about next week, a couple years ago, where it wasn't exactly the Ash setting. It was conformity on a wine tasting, in a wine tasting setting. And I found, relatively high levels of conformity, but you can't really directly compare it to the Ash setting. So if the question is, do we still conform to the extent that Ash found in 1951 or in his replications throughout the 50s of his study, If that's the question, I'd say the answer is we conform still, but maybe less. Cultural shifts have led us to conform to a less extreme extent, but we still do conform a lot. Okay. So this brings us to a really, really important distinction that is one of the great ideas from the class, I think. Because I think it really clarifies your understanding of how other people influence your opinion, your spoken opinion, your private opinions, and it really is the best idea, I would say, in the history of conformity research. The Ash study, the Sharif study are great demonstrations of the extent of conformity, especially the Ash study, right? You know, where people are conforming to something they know isn't true or should know is not true. This is an idea, and an idea that really clarifies the way we think about these things. Okay, and the idea is from Deutsch and Girard, 1955, which you've all read, so this is all redundant. And the idea is that there's two forms of conformity, normative influence and informational influence. Christy, this is what you wanted, this is what you got. Normative and informational influence. Normative influence is conformity to the views or expectations of others in pursuit of social approval or avoidance of disapproval. So this is when you conform because you want to not be embarrassed, you want to not be sanctioned, you want to not be privately judged or perceived as an idiot in other people's eyes. Which study does that correspond to? Which study is the best example of normative influence? Ash study, right? They know the right answer, but they conform anyway. Why do they do this? Presumably because they don't want to look like morons in front of these people. Not because they really know the right answer. Or they think the group knows the right answer. They don't think that. The other kind of influence is informational influence, where you use other people's behavior or attitudes as information or evidence about reality. You don't know the right answer. You rely on other people to try and get the right answer. You're not trying to seek approval or avoid embarrassment or not be sanctioned or privately judged. That's not the reason. Instead, you don't know the right answer. You're trying to get the right answer, and so you rely on the group. So here's some examples of this distinction. I should say, which study corresponds to informational influence? Sharif, right. You have no clue how much the red dot moved. You rely on these other people to try to get the right answer. Okay, so some examples of this distinction as I uselessly use this thing again. No. All right, so, Okay, so you don't know what class you should take, so you get your friend's advice about what class you should take. What kind of influence is that? Informational, exactly. I can't imagine what the normative equivalent of that would be. Maybe like 10 of your friends all bully you into taking Geology 101 or something. Okay, your friends pressure you to do something. This is purely hypothetical. I'm sure this never happened to you. Your friends pressure you into doing something you know is risky and dumb. What kind of influence is that? Right. And you know, normative, exactly. You know it's dumb. You know privately you shouldn't do this. They don't convince you it's a smart thing to do. You do it knowing it's risky and dumb. Again, hypothetically, that's normative influence. You're doing it to avoid being judged or something like that. Okay, you want to find a good place to eat in Berkeley. So you go to Yelp.com to find a good place to eat. What kind of influence is that? Exactly. You don't even know these people who've made these ratings online, right? And so, you know, how could they normatively influence you? You'll never see them again. They'll never know what restaurant you went to, and so on. They actually have this funny story, or this economists use this example when they talk about informational influence, where they say you open a new restaurant, 2 new restaurants in New York City, right? 2 new restaurants open up. They're next door to one another. The first person that walks up to them and wants to go, get dinner, they don't know which one is better. They have no clue which one's better, so they just randomly choose to go to, say, this restaurant, right? Then the next person comes along. They also have no clue which restaurant is better. So what do? They go to the restaurant that has 1 person in it and don't go to the one with 0 people. And then the next person's like, oh, wow, well, 2 people like this restaurant. I'm going to go here, and I'm not going to go to this one with no people in it. That one must suck. And then eventually this restaurant has, dozens of people in it, turns a profit, survives. This one goes under in a week. And it was just an artifact of just this random initial decision. Okay. That's cute. Okay, so another one. You go to a bar that none of you go to bars, but were you to hypothetically go to bars, you could go to one that you hate, and I assume you have one in mind now, because all your friends want to go, you don't want to go, you don't change your mind. What kind of influence is that? Exactly. Okay. Okay, so Deutsch and Girard in their paper identify a variety of factors that contribute to normative and informational influence, including the following observations. First, groups create more normative influence than a bunch of individuals. So when if you were to somehow be exposed to a bunch of individuals individually, they would exert some normative influence on you, but there's something different about when it all comes together in a group. So if, if say you call all your friends, you're like, which bar are we going to tonight? Then, again, hypothetically, and you call them all, and they're all like, oh, we're totally going to, I don't know, the Bears Lair, well, I'm not going to diss, some tiki lounge in Alameda, we'll say that. And you're like, oh, I don't really want to go to the tiki lounge in Alameda, why are we always going to the tiki lounge in Alameda? And you're, it's not that hard to tell one person that, right? And so you tell each person this, and it's not so hard for you to resist the normative influence. But imagine you're in a setting with 8 people, right? And they're like, we're totally going to that badass tiki lounge in Alameda. You're like, awesome. I can't wait to go. It's going to be great. I'm going to get one of those coconut drinks, and it's going to be wonderful. Okay. Another situation, when your view will be anonymous, there's less normative influence. That's like so obvious, I'm not going to go into it. If your view was anonymous in the Ash setting, you wouldn't be influenced because no one would even know what your opinion was. Okay, so I don't know why Deutsch and Girard bothered to point that out. But if your view was anonymous, if you were submitting your view anonymously, there would be, that would not reduce informational influence, right? Does this make sense? So, for example, the Yelp.com example, right? You're trying to find the restaurant. The only kind of influence going on is informational influence. It doesn't matter if these people don't know what restaurant you go to, right? Because it's informational influence. You're trying to get information from the group. Or, in the Sharif setting, you are in a group, you assimilate to the group, then you split up into individuals, and you keep saying what the group said, right? That's what we found. The group, individual condition. People keep saying what the group said. Why? Even though their view is anonymous, it's not normative influence, it's informational influence. Can somebody wake that man up who fell asleep last Tuesday? Yes. You're missing college, sir. Okay. All right. Uncertainty increases normative and informational influence. Now, this is interesting. We would understand why uncertainty would increase informational influence. Uncertainty increases informational influence because you don't know the right answer, right? So that makes perfect sense. And that's what Sharif was trying to capture. And that's what Ash was trying to eliminate. He was trying to create a situation that's not uncertain at all. Now, why would uncertainty increase your normative influence or your willingness to be normatively influenced? Well, I think the reason is that your normative influence is a function in part of how strongly you believe your own private belief, right? So if people call you up and they're like, let's go to that tiki bar in Alameda, and you've never been there before, you don't have a strong opinion about it, it's an uncertain quantity to you, you just know it sounds ridiculous, you'll be more likely to go than if you've gone 10 times, have a very strong opinion about the tiki lounge, and you're like, no, I'm totally not going. So uncertainty increases both normative and informational influence, though perhaps for somewhat different reasons. It can increase normative influence because it undermines your conviction. It increases informational influence because it means you just don't know the right answer. It increases, not undermines. Also, other people's uncertainty will decrease their normative influence over you. If the people call you up or pressure you in the group and they're like, oh, maybe we should go to the tiki lounge because that would be awesome, then that's going to have less influence on you than if they say so certainly, right? And if the 8 Confederates in the Ash setting had said, oh, I think maybe it's number 3, but I'm not so sure, I bet conformity rates would be pretty low. Okay, so what are some other factors that affect normative influence? Group size, right? Ash showed that, right? 3 people or more, that's a lot of influence. 1 or 2 people trying to pressure you to say the wrong thing, not much influence. Group unanimity. So when everybody's saying it, that's more stronger normative pressure than when everybody but one. Remember, the lone dissenter essentially killed this effect in the Ash study. So group size, bigger groups influence you more. More unanimity influences you more. Also, when a group has a great deal of solidarity or cohesion, like maybe certain kinds of churches do, or the military, they can exert more normative influence. Why? Probably because you care more about judgments of you in other people's eyes. When people are judging you, you really want them to think well of you because you feel great investment in this group. Along the same lines, an individual's degree of identification with the group should also increase conformity. Because you value these group members, you really want them to accept you and judge you positively, so you fall in line with their attitudes. Also, the status of your status relative to other group members can affect how much normative influence can affect your view, right? So you can imagine in certain settings where you're the least respected person, you feel this greater pressure to go along with the group. But in other settings where you're the most respected person, you might not only not go along with the group, but you might be the person that decides what they think. And then also investment or commitment to the group. And here I'm thinking of like when prophecy fails a little bit, right? These people who dumped all their possessions and dove into the group head first and were totally invested and committed to the group, had no way out. They really didn't have any choice but to be normatively influenced when Mrs. Keach told them that they had saved everybody from the flood. So what factors affect informational influence? Well, some of the same factors, but some different ones as well. Perceived intelligence or competence of other people relative to you, right? When you think they're really smart, then you're like, oh, they maybe know the right answer. Very simple. Also, the number of others. You know, this many people can't be wrong about this restaurant, right? If you see ratings of the honesty of somebody on eBay and there's 500 ratings, you'll weight that more heavily than if there's 2 ratings, right? The number of others gives you more information or gives you more reliable information. Also, unanimity, right? When everybody went to that Thai restaurant and said it's badass, and literally everybody, then you think, oh, well, that's good, okay? But if like, half the people did, then not so much. And then, of course, your own uncertainty, which we already talked about. In the Sharif study, you're extremely uncertain. You're very easily influenced at an informational level. And if you're anything like me, you're thinking a little bit about balance theory right now, right? Because we talked about here, you're more influenced when you like the group, identify with the group members, and you're invested or committed to the group. That kind of reminds me of balance theory, right? Where you have this positive tie to the group or to group members, and that leads you to be more likely to assimilate to their view towards something, right? Like your date likes you, you like Kung Fu Panda, so she or he is likely to fall in line with your view of Kung Fu Panda. This is a picture of a large group of people. That's what conformity looks like. I don't know why I put this here. Whatever. Okay, that's just, yeah. Okay. So some conformity quotes. There are a few, so don't pack up. The opposite of courage in our society is not cowardice. It is conformity, Rollo May. The reward for conformity is that everyone likes you but yourself, Rita Mae Brown. I'm totally going through a rebel period right now. It's sort of waning, but am I allowed, right? Is it okay, right, for me to be going through a rebel period? Ridiculous. Claire Danes. You get it? Okay, I get it. Okay. Mikhail Bakunin, to revolt is a natural tendency of life. In general, the vitality and relative dignity of an animal can be measured by the intensity of its instinct to revolt. And my favorite Henry David Thoreau quote, maybe my favorite social psychology quote, the greater part of what my neighbors call good, I believe in my soul to be bad, and if I repent of anything, it is very likely to be my good behavior. What demon possessed me that I behaved so well? Okay, that's it. I'll see you on Thursday.